The sun over Redemption Flats was not a friend. It was a hammer, beating the last of the green from the prairie grass, leaving it the color of old bones from the porch of her small clapboard house. Sarah Whitfield could see the mountains, a distant, hazy, purple promise of coolness that never arrived. The air tasted of dust, a fine red grit that settled in the lines of her hands, on the windowsill, and in the back of her throat. It was the start of the dry season, the time of year when the wind whispered of fire and the well handle came up feeling lighter each day. Her son, Noah, who was 6 years old and all knees and elbows, sat on the bottom step, meticulously arranging a line of pebbles. He was a quiet boy, with his father's dark hair but her own serious eyes, watching him. A familiar ache tightened Sarah's chest. It was the fear, sharp and sudden, that she was not enough, that this land and this life were too hard, and that she would fail to shield him from it. Her goal, every morning she woke, was simple and immense: to keep the ranch alive through the drought, to make sure there was food on the table and a roof over this boy's head. The screen door creaked open and Jasper stepped out, smelling of lilac water and stale whiskey. He was handsome. No one could deny it. With a smile that could charm a snake off a rock. It had certainly charmed her. He adjusted the brim of his hat, his gaze skipping over the thirsty fields and landing somewhere far beyond the horizon. "Looks like another scorcher," he said, his voice light, as if commenting on a passing cloud. He never seemed to feel the weight of the heat, the way it pressed down on a person's soul. Sarah said nothing, just ran a hand over Noah's hair. The well was nearly dry. The creek bed was a ribbon of cracked mud. 2 calves had been born weak, and she was nursing them with a mix of watered milk and prayer. These were the worries that woke her in the night. Jasper's worries were of a different sort. "I'm heading into town," he announced, not looking at her. "See if there's any word on work up at the silver mines." It was an old, worn excuse. The silver mines were a dream he polished whenever the reality of ranching became too tedious. The reality of it was tedious most days. Sarah knew where he was going. He was going to the saloon, where the laughter was easy, and Lila May served drinks with a smile that was a little too bright. The whole town knew. She could feel their knowledge in the way Mrs. Thornton, the banker's wife, looked at her in the general store, a mixture of pity and accusation in her eyes. She could hear it in the careful, hollow way Reverend Pike spoke of a wife's duty to maintain a harmonious home in Redemption Flats. The law was a suggestion, but gossip was scripture. "The fence by the south pasture needs mending," Sarah said, her voice even. "A steer got through yesterday." Jasper sighed, a theatrical sound of a man burdened by petty concerns. "It'll hold for another day. A man's got to chase his fortune. Sarah, we can't get rich pulling splinters out of fence posts." He bent and ruffled Noah's hair, a gesture that looked warm but felt empty. "Be good for your mother, son." He walked away without a backward glance, his long-legged stride full of a purpose that had nothing to do with them. Sarah watched him go, the dust rising around his boots. A part of her, a part she hated, felt a familiar shame. It was a cold whisper that said she had failed to be the kind of woman a man like Jasper would want to stay home for. The sky began to change in the late afternoon. The gold of the sun bled into a sickly orange, and the wind, which had been a hot breath all day, began to pick up a mean, fretful howl. Sarah scanned the horizon. A brown wall was building in the west, churning and growing, eating the purple of the mountains. A dust storm, and a bad one, by the looks of it. "Noah, inside, now!" she said, her voice sharp with an urgency that made the boy scramble to his feet, his pebbles forgotten. She hustled him into the small, dark house, the wind slamming the door shut behind them. The air grew thick, the light failing as if a heavy blanket had been thrown over the sun. Outside, the world disappeared into a roaring, gritty twilight. Sand and dirt blasted against the walls, finding its way through every crack. A relentless invasion. Sarah stuffed rags under the door and around the window frames, but the fine red powder still sifted in, coating every surface, making her cough. Through the window, she saw the blurred shapes of the calves huddling against the barn, their bawling lost in the shriek of the wind. The barn door, the one with the broken latch Jasper had promised to fix, was shuddering, threatening to fly open and scatter the animals to the mercy of the storm. "Stay here," she told Noah, who was huddled by the cold stove, his eyes wide. "Do not open the door." She tied a kerchief over her nose and mouth and plunged into the maelstrom. The wind hit her like a solid wall, stealing her breath. She could barely see, her world reduced to a swirling vortex of red-brown. Leaning into the gale, she fought her way to the barn, the force of the wind trying to tear the door from her hands as she wrestled with it. She needed rope. She needed another pair of hands. Suddenly, a figure materialized out of the gloom, tall and broad-shouldered. Caleb Hart. His face was grim, his hat pulled low. He moved with a calm economy, taking the splintered edge of the door from her without a word. He was their neighbor to the east, a man who spoke little and worked hard. He had lost his own wife to a fever 2 years back and had kept mostly to himself since. His grief, a quiet, steady presence that everyone in Redemption Flats respected enough to leave alone. Together, they forced the heavy door shut against the wind's fury. Caleb took a length of rope from his belt and, with a few powerful, efficient movements, lashed the door to a support post. He checked the knot, his hands sure and steady. He turned to her, his eyes the color of a winter sky. Meeting hers for a brief moment, he had to shout to be heard over the wind. "Your calves look spooked. Better get them settled." She nodded, a wave of gratitude so strong it almost buckled her knees. She fought her way into the barn, the air thick with the smell of animals and fear. Caleb followed, helping her guide the terrified calves into a pen, his calm presence seeming to soothe them. When they were secure, he stood by the door, the storm a muffled roar outside. "I've got a few extra bales of hay in my wagon," he said, his voice back to its usual quiet timbre. "Your supply must be running low. I can leave them by the porch when this blows over." "I can't pay you for it yet, Caleb," she said, her voice raspy with dust and pride. "It's not a loan, Sarah. It's for the stock. Neighbors help neighbors." He looked around the dusty barn, his gaze taking in the mended tools, the neatly stacked supplies. He saw the work she put in, the work Jasper overlooked. He did not say anything about her husband's absence. He did not need to. The empty space where Jasper should have been was as loud as the storm. He gave a small, respectful nod and slipped back out into the wind, disappearing as quickly as he had come. Sarah stayed in the barn for a long time, listening to the wind and the soft sounds of the animals. When the storm finally exhausted itself, it left behind a world transformed. Everything was covered in a blanket of red dust. It lay thick on the porch railings, filled the water trough, and clung to the leaves of the struggling vegetable patch. The world felt scoured, raw, and unnervingly silent. When she went back inside, Noah was asleep, curled on the rag rug. On the kitchen table, held down by a salt shaker, was a piece of paper torn from a ledger. "Jasper's familiar." Careless scrawl filled the page. "Gone to find my fortune. Don't wait up." Sarah stared at the words, her mind strangely blank. There was no shock, not really, just a deep, cold certainty, like dropping a stone into a well and never hearing it hit the bottom. She picked up the note, folded it once, twice, and tucked it into the pocket of her apron. She did not cry. She looked at her sleeping son, at the film of red dust on the floor, at the long shadows stretching across the prairie. The shame was still there, but now it had a companion, a hard, brittle anger. She walked to the front door and pushed it open. The air was clean, washed by the wind. She looked toward the Hart place, where a single lamp glowed in the window, a small point of light in the vast, gathering dark. She felt utterly, terrifyingly alone. But as she stood there, she also felt a flicker of something else, something she had not felt in a long time. It was a stubborn, unyielding resolve. This was her land, bought with her father's inheritance. This was her son. She would not be blown away like so much dust. 3 days later, the mail rider came by, his horse kicking up the settled red powder. He handed her a single letter, his expression carefully neutral. It was from the bank in town, the envelope crisp and official. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. The words were simple, cold, and final. The interest payment on the loan Jasper had taken out against the ranch was overdue. If it was not paid in full within 30 days, the bank would begin foreclosure proceedings. Sarah read the letter twice, the paper rattling in her hand. 30 days. The well was nearly dry. The hay was almost gone, and the red dust of the prairie seemed to settle deeper into her bones, a weight that threatened to bury her. The bank letter felt like a hot coal in her apron pocket. For 2 days, Sarah went about her chores with a rigid back and a tight jaw, the words of foreclosure echoing with every pump of the well handle, every swing of the axe. The 30 days felt less like a deadline and more like a sentence. On the 3rd morning, she dressed Noah in his cleanest, most mended shirt and hitched their old mare to the buckboard. If she was going to be told no, she wanted it said to her face. Redemption. Flats was a single dusty street flanked by false front buildings that looked tired of standing up straight. The bank was the most imposing of them all, made of brick with tall, narrow windows like disapproving eyes. Inside, it was cool and dark and smelled of paper and old money. Mr. Kramer, a man whose body was as soft as his gaze was hard, sat behind a large oak desk. He peered at Sarah over his spectacles as she explained her situation, her voice low and steady. Noah stood beside her, his small hand gripping hers tightly. Mr. Kramer listened with an expression of polite impatience. He cleared his throat when she finished. Sarah, he began, his tone dripping with condescension. The bank is not a charity. Jasper took out the loan. The ranch is the collateral. It is a simple matter of business. It is my home, Sarah said, the words costing her. My son's home. It was bought with my father's money. I need an extension, just until I can sell the new calves. The calves you have are barely weaned and the market is poor, he countered smoothly. I understand this is a difficult position for a woman to be in. Perhaps you should consider selling a portion of the land, or, better yet, returning to your family. Do you not have an aunt and uncle in the next county? The shame was a physical blow. Stealing her breath, he wanted her to run, to fold, to disappear, to become someone else's problem. She pulled Noah a little closer. I am not leaving my home. Mr. Kramer. His face hardened. Then I suggest you find the money. 30 days. Good day to you. The ride back to the ranch was silent. The sun beat down, and the prairie seemed to stretch on forever, vast and indifferent. The hope she had carried into town, small and fragile as a bird's egg, had been crushed. That evening, as she was listlessly scattering feed for the chickens, Caleb Hart walked over, his steps slow and deliberate. He stopped a respectful distance from the fence that separated their properties. I was in town earlier, he said, his voice quiet. I saw you leaving the bank. He did not ask what happened. He did not have to. The answer was written all over her face. She just nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. He leaned against a fence post. Considering, my well is deep. It has never run dry, but my vegetable garden is a disgrace and my shirts are missing half their buttons. I am no good with a needle. He paused, letting the words settle. I was thinking of digging a new well over here, closer to the creek bed. The ground is softer. I could use the help of a strong back to clear the rock. And my boy, Thomas, he could use some fresh squash this winter. Sarah stared at him, understanding dawning slowly. He was not offering charity. He was proposing a trade. Her pride, so wounded by Mr. Kramer's suggestion, felt a small, soothing balm. Still, she hesitated. I do not have a strong back, Caleb. You have a strong will. That is more important. He looked directly at her then, and his gaze was clear and honest. I will help you dig in return. You help me plant and you do some mending. An exchange of labor, even terms. A week later, Caleb was on her land, his sleeves rolled up, his shovel biting into the hard, dry earth. The work was brutal. Sarah hauled away buckets of dirt and rock until her arms screamed and her back felt like it would snap. But with every bucket full, she felt a sliver of control returning. She was not just waiting for foreclosure. She was fighting it. One afternoon, as she paused to wipe the sweat from her brow, she watched Caleb work the auger, his muscles straining. Are you digging a well or digging at my pride? Caleb Hart, she asked, the words sharper than she intended. He stopped and looked up, a rare, faint smile touching the corners of his mouth. He wiped his own face with the back of a dusty hand. Every well has a source of water. Sarah, he said, his voice gentle, as long as you do not give up and stop digging. The whisper started soon after. When Sarah went to the general store for flour and salt, she felt the conversation stop. She saw the women huddled together, their eyes following her, their mouths forming words she could not hear but could easily imagine. Mrs. Thornton walked past her without a word, her nose in the air, a silent, powerful condemnation. A woman abandoned by her husband, now with another man working on her land. The conclusion was swift and ugly in the small minds of Redemption Flats. The gossip hurt more than the hard labor. It was another layer of dust, settling on her, trying to suffocate her. That evening, she found Caleb reinforcing a section of fence that bordered their properties. The whole town is talking, she said, her voice tight. They think you and I... She could not bring herself to say the words. Caleb did not stop his work. He methodically wrapped the wire, his movements precise. Let them talk, he said without turning around. Talk is wind. It blows itself out. It is not just wind, she insisted, her voice rising. It is my name. It is Noah's name. The thought of giving up his help, of facing the drought and the bank alone, was terrifying. But the thought of being seen as a fallen woman was a different kind of terror. Caleb finally stopped and turned to face her. His expression was serious, his eyes steady. Sarah, you can't fight a dust storm by standing in the open and yelling at it. You find shelter and you let it pass. He took a step closer, his voice dropping. So you let me stand in the wind's path for a while? I can take it. His quiet strength was a shield. She looked at this calm, decent man, and for the first time, she did not feel entirely alone. She gave a small, grateful nod, and they went back to their work. Noah, who had been wary and watchful since his father left, slowly began to thaw around Caleb. He would follow him as he worked, a small, silent shadow. One day, Caleb was checking the saddle on his horse and noticed the boy watching him intently. Ever learned to tie a grief knot? Caleb asked. Noah shook his head. Caleb patiently showed him how to loop the leather thong, his large, calloused hands moving with surprising dexterity. It is a good knot. It holds tight, but you can undo it quick if you need to. He looked over at Sarah, who was watching from the porch. With your mother's permission, you can practice on this old lead rope. He was not stepping into Jasper's shoes. He was carefully walking around them, always acknowledging that Sarah was the one in charge. The small alliance they had formed was tested not by gossip, but by nature itself. One of her calves, one of the two she had fought so hard to save, began to drool, a strange foam gathering at its mouth. It refused to eat, and its feet were tender. The next day, one of Caleb's own calves showed the same signs, foot and mouth sickness. It could sweep through a herd and wipe out a rancher in a matter of weeks. They worked together, their personal boundaries dissolving in the face of a shared crisis. They built a quarantine pen far from the healthy animals, their movements synchronized by urgency. The veterinarian was 2 days' ride away and likely would not come for just 2 sick animals. It felt hopeless. That night, Sarah was sitting by her cold stove, her mind racing. When a memory surfaced, it was of her grandmother, a woman who had crossed the plains in a covered wagon and knew remedies the land provided. She remembered her grandmother talking about a tobacco poultice for sick cattle, a foul-smelling concoction that was said to draw out the fever. It was a long shot, but it was better than doing nothing. The next morning, she told Caleb. He did not question her. He simply went to his own cabin and returned with his pouch of chewing tobacco. They mixed it with hot water and crushed herbs, creating a dark, pungent paste. They forced it into the mouths of the sick calves and wrapped their tender hooves in rags soaked with the stuff. Then, all they could do was wait. One of Caleb's calves was too weak and died that night, but Sarah's calf, and another one of Caleb's that had started showing symptoms, seemed to rally. By the end of the week, the fever had broken. They were weak and thin, but they were alive. They had saved 2. It was not a miracle, but it was enough. A fragile peace settled over the 2 small ranches. The well was getting deeper, the garden was sprouting tiny green shoots, and a pile of mended shirts sat neatly folded on Caleb's kitchen table. A routine was born of shared labor and mutual respect. They were 2 separate ranches, but they were no longer 2 separate people struggling in isolation. They were partners, guarding a fragile frontier against hardship. The peace was shattered on a Tuesday. Sarah was returning from the new well, a full bucket of water in each hand, a testament to their hard work. She saw a rider coming, kicking up a plume of dust. As he got closer, her heart froze. The horse was too fine, the saddle too new, the man's posture too confident. Jasper reined in his horse in front of the house, swinging down from the saddle with his old, familiar grace. He was wearing a new shirt. His boots were polished, and he smelled of expensive liquor. He looked like he had, indeed, found his fortune. His eyes swept over the yard, taking in the neat wood pile, the mended fence, the deep, dark circle of earth that marked the new well. His gaze flickered toward Caleb's property and then back to her. A slow, unpleasant smile spread across his face. "Well, well," Jasper said, his voice smooth as oil. "Looks like you have been busy." He took a step toward her, and she instinctively took a step back. "I have come back with a business proposition. Sarah, an investment opportunity. Lila May and I are going to be partners." He paused for effect. "I need you to agree to sell half the ranch. We need the capital." The 2 buckets of water sloshed, heavy in Sarah's hands. Jasper's words hung in the dry air, more offensive than the dust, more suffocating than the heat. Sell half the ranch that was her only anchor in a world that had come loose from its moorings. She set the buckets down with a thud, the water splashing over her worn boots. "No," she said. The word was quiet, but it was as solid and unmovable as the purple mountains on the horizon. Jasper's charming smile faltered for a second. "Now, Sarah, be reasonable. This is a chance for us. For me. Lila May has connections. We just need a little capital to get started. You would not want to stand in the way of my fortune, would you?" "There is no us, Jasper," she replied, her voice gaining strength. "There is me and my son, and this land. It is not for sale." His face darkened, the easy charm vanishing like a puddle in the sun. He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a menacing purr. "Do not forget, my name is on that deed right alongside yours. The law says I have a right to my share. I can force a sale." He reached out and grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her skin. "You will sign the papers." Before Sarah could react, a calm voice cut through the tension. "I would take my hand off her. Jasper." Caleb Hart stood by the newly mended fence, his posture relaxed, but his eyes as hard as granite. He had not made a sound as he approached. He simply was there. A solid presence against the shimmering heat. Jasper let go of her arm as if it were a hot coal, turning to face Caleb with a sneer. "Well, look what we have here. The helpful neighbor. You been keeping my wife company? Hart keeping her fields plowed?" Caleb's expression did not change. He ignored the insult. "I heard you were talking about the law," he said, his voice even. "If you want to talk law, then we should ride into town and talk to Magistrate Thompson. He is a fair man. He can look at the deed. He might be interested to see that Sarah's half of this property was a dowry from her father, paid for in cash long before you ever put your name on anything." Jasper's face went pale. He had forgotten that detail, or perhaps had never considered it important. It was a legal snag, a complication to his simple plan. He looked from Caleb's unyielding face to Sarah's resolute one, and he knew he had lost this round. "This is not over," he spat, his voice tight with fury. He swung himself back onto his fine horse, yanking the reins harder than necessary. "You will regret this, Sarah, both of you!" He galloped away, leaving a cloud of angry red dust in his wake. The encounter left a bitter taste in Sarah's mouth. It also left a new, more dangerous current in the town's stream of gossip. 2 days later, when she went to the general store, the whispers were no longer just about a lonely wife and a kind neighbor. Now they were about a woman who had openly defied her husband, with another man standing as her champion. It was a scandal. "Mrs.?" Thornton cornered her by the barrels of dried beans, her face a mask of pious disapproval. "Sarah Whitfield," she said, her voice loud enough for half the store to hear. "I am shocked, utterly shocked, to turn your husband away, and to so flagrantly associate with another man. You are making a mockery of the sanctity of marriage and bringing shame upon this entire community." Sarah felt her face flush with heat. "My husband abandoned me and my son. Mrs. Thornton, he returned only to try and sell our home out from under us. A wife's duty is to be forgiving, to maintain the home for his return." "Mrs." Thornton declared, her jowls quivering with indignation. "Instead, you have chosen this brazen path. You have become a poor example for all the good, God-fearing women of this town." That afternoon, another visitor came to the ranch. Reverend Pike sat stiffly in her kitchen, his hat in his lap, his eyes avoiding hers. He cleared his throat. "My dear Sarah," he began, his voice oozing a practiced, gentle concern. "I have come as a friend. I know your heart must be heavy, but you must consider your reputation. And the boy. A boy needs a good name to grow up with." "I am doing my best to provide for him," Sarah said, her hands clenched in her lap. Of course," the Reverend soothed. "But in this world, a woman's honor is a fragile thing. When it is tarnished, it can cast a long shadow." He finally looked at her, his gaze full of pity. "Perhaps the most honorable course of action would be to remove yourself from the situation. A fresh start, elsewhere. It would quiet the talk. It would be a sacrifice. Yes, but a noble one, for the sake of your son's future and the peace of this community." He was telling her to run. The banker, the preacher, the town's leading lady, they all had the same solution: she should disappear. She should pack up her shame and take it somewhere else. For a moment, the weight of their judgment felt unbearable. The thought of packing up, of leaving the dust and the debt and the whispers behind, was a powerful temptation. She could go live with her aunt and uncle, be a poor relation, a burden, a woman with a story she could never tell. But then she looked out the window at the endless stretch of golden grass, at the sturdy barn, at the dark earth that held the promise of water from the new well. She thought of her father, a man who had worked this land until his hands were cracked and his back was bent. He had left it to her, not to Jasper. It was in her blood. I will not move. Reverend, she said, her voice quiet but firm. This is my father's land. This is my home. Reverend Pike left with a sigh of disappointment, as if she had failed a test of character he had set for her. That night, Sarah felt a profound loneliness, a sense that she was on a small island, with a sea of disapproval rising around her. But in the center of that loneliness was a hard kernel of resolve. She would not be washed away. The darkness came quickly that night, a moonless, starless black that swallowed the prairie. Sarah put Noah to bed, reading to him from a tattered book until his breathing evened out into the deep rhythm of sleep. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time, mending one of Noah's shirts by the light of a single kerosene lamp. The silence was absolute. She was startled awake by a cough. Noah was standing in the doorway, rubbing his eyes. "Mama, my throat feels scratchy." At the same time, she smelled it, a sharp, acrid scent that was not wood smoke from her stove. It was something else, something hungry. She stood up, her heart beginning to pound. A faint, unnatural orange light flickered against the kitchen window. She ran to the door and threw it open. The sight stole her breath and turned her blood to ice. The hay barn. The smaller of their two barns, but the one that held all the precious winter feed for the livestock, was on fire. Flames were already licking up the dry wooden walls, reaching for the night sky like greedy, terrible fingers. Her first thought was Noah. She scooped him up, his small body trembling, and carried him out to the relative safety of the porch, wrapping him in a blanket. "Stay here, baby. Do not move." Her mind raced. The calves. They were in the pen right beside the burning barn. She grabbed a bucket from the well, the one she had filled that afternoon, and ran toward the fire. The heat was immense, a physical force that pushed her back. She threw the water on the flames, a pathetic hissing gesture that did nothing. A wave of despair washed over her. It was hopeless. She was going to lose everything. Then she heard shouting. Two figures burst out of the darkness from the direction of the Hart Ranch. It was Caleb and his hired hand, a lanky young man named Jeb. They were already carrying buckets. "Get the animals out," Caleb yelled, his voice a commanding roar over the crackle of the fire. "Jeb, get the pump going at the new well. Sarah, help me with the gate." The fear that had paralyzed her broke. Adrenaline surged through her veins. She and Caleb fought with the pen gate, the metal hot to the touch. They drove the terrified, bawling calves out into the open pasture, away from the blaze. Meanwhile, Jeb worked the new hand pump with frantic energy, filling bucket after bucket. They formed a line, a desperate bucket brigade against the roaring inferno. They worked until their muscles burned and their lungs were raw from smoke. They could not save the barn, but they kept the flames from spreading to the main barn and the house. They saved the animals. As the fire finally began to die down, consuming the last of the hay and collapsing in on itself, the three of them stood there, chests heaving, faces and clothes black with soot. Noah was crying on the porch, his small sobs cutting through the night. Sarah ran to him, holding him tight, murmuring reassurances she did not feel. Caleb walked over, his face grim in the ghostly light of the dying embers. "Are you and the boy all right?" he asked, his voice hoarse. She nodded, unable to speak. The next morning, Sheriff Dawes rode out. He was a weary man with a drooping mustache who had seen too much trouble in his life. He walked around the smoldering ruins, poking at the blackened timber with the toe of his boot. "Lost all your winter feed," he observed, stating the obvious. That's a hard blow. "We saved the livestock," Sarah said, her voice a croak. The sheriff nodded, his eyes scanning the ground. "Found some footprints over by the fence line," he said, pointing. "One set, a man's boots. Looks like, but they are too scuffed up to get a clear print. Could be anyone's." He looked at her, his gaze sharp. "You seen Jasper around lately?" "He was here a few days ago." She admitted he was angry. Angry enough to do this? She thought of the look on Jasper's face as he had ridden away. The pure, spiteful rage. But she had no proof. "I do not know," she whispered. The sheriff sighed. "Could have been him. Could have been a drifter. Could have been a spark from a passing train. Though the tracks are a fair way off. Could have been Jasper, drunk and careless with a lantern." He shook his head. "Without a witness. Sarah, it is just a fire. I am sorry." He tipped his hat and rode away, leaving her alone with the smoking ruin of her future. The loss was devastating. The bank payment was impossible before. Now, it was a joke. She had nothing. As she stood there, numb with despair, she saw another rider approaching. It was the sheriff's young deputy. He looked uncomfortable as he dismounted and walked toward her, holding out a folded piece of paper. "Ma'am," he said, avoiding her eyes. "Sheriff asked me to deliver this to you. It is a court summons." Her fingers felt stiff and clumsy as she took the paper and unfolded it. The legal language was dense, but the meaning was brutally clear. Jasper Whitfield was suing her. He was demanding that the court order the immediate sale and division of the property. And then came the final, vicious blow. He was also petitioning the court for sole custody of their son, Noah, on the grounds that she was a woman of immoral character, and that, due to the recent fire, she was clearly incapable of providing a safe and stable home. The court summons felt heavier than a branding iron in Sarah's hand. It was not just a legal document. It was a public declaration of her failure. Jasper was not content to have merely abandoned her. He now intended to strip her of everything that remained her home, her name, and her son. The fire had taken her security. This piece of paper was meant to take her soul. The news spread through Redemption Flats faster than a prairie fire. The town council called a public meeting to discuss community stability, a thinly veiled excuse to put Sarah Whitfield and her troubles on public display. She went because not going would have been an admission of guilt. She walked into the town hall with her head held high, holding Noah's hand, feeling the weight of 100 pairs of eyes. Mr. Kramer, the banker, spoke first. He did not mention Sarah by name, but every word was aimed at her. He spoke of the importance of sound finances, of properties being managed by capable hands, of the unfortunate situations that arise when arrangements become unstable. He spoke of Jasper Whitfield as a man of ambition, a man looking to make investments that could benefit the entire town. The implication was clear: Jasper was an asset, and Sarah was a liability. He was quietly lining up support for Jasper, knowing that if the ranch were sold, he would control the terms and likely acquire the land himself for a fraction of its worth. Sarah sat on the hard wooden bench, listening to her life being debated as if it were a matter of fencing or water rights. She felt small, voiceless, and utterly alone. But she was not alone. The next day, Caleb Hart rode into town. He did not go to the saloon or the bank. He went to the small house behind the general store where Mrs. Gable, the town seamstress, lived. He found her on her porch, her fingers a blur as she worked on a new dress. He spoke to her for a long time, his voice low and earnest. He left with a nod from the old woman. Next, he found Elias, the mail carrier, sorting letters at the post office. Elias was a man who saw everything, who knew the rhythms of every household on his route. He knew how early Sarah's lamp was lit and how late it burned. He had seen her mending tack, hauling water, and working alongside Caleb at the new well, her face grim with determination. Finally, Caleb went to see Dr. Murphy, the veterinarian. A gruff man with gentle hands, he reminded the doctor of the night he had been called out to the Whitfield ranch to help with a difficult birth, how Sarah had worked tirelessly by his side, her knowledge of her animals clear and profound. He reminded him of the 2 calves she had recently saved from foot and mouth sickness with a folk remedy. That evening, Caleb came to her porch as the sun was setting, casting long, lonely shadows across the burnt grass. "I spoke to some people," he said simply. "Mrs. Gable, Elias, Dr. Murphy. They have all agreed to speak for you at the hearing, to tell the magistrate what kind of woman you are." Sarah looked at him, at his tired face and dusty clothes, and a wave of emotion so powerful it threatened to drown her washed over her. He was not just helping her dig a well. He was helping her rebuild the foundations of her life. "Why, Caleb," she whispered, "why are you doing all this?" He looked out at the darkening prairie, his gaze fixed on some point in the distance. "Because it is the right thing to do," he said, "and because I do not like bullies." His quiet support gave her a strength she did not know she possessed. That night, she decided she would not let men like Mr. Kramer and Reverend Pike define her. She would define herself. Standing in her small kitchen, she began to speak the words she would say to the magistrate, her voice gaining confidence with each repetition. "I am not a perfect woman. I have made mistakes. But every calf that is still alive on that land is alive because of these two hands. Every fence post that is standing because I put it there. This is my home, and I will not be driven from it." The weather turned a week before the hearing. The sky took on a bruised yellowish hue, and the wind began to howl, a low, mournful sound that promised violence. Another dust storm was coming, bigger and meaner than the last one. Caleb and Sarah worked with a desperate, unspoken urgency. They boarded up windows, secured the livestock in the main barn, and filled dozens of burlap sacks with sand to weigh down the roof of the root cellar. They moved as a team, their actions fluid and coordinated, a dance born of shared purpose. The wind tore at them, plastering their clothes to their bodies and filling the air with a blinding, choking cloud of topsoil. They finally stumbled into her kitchen, gasping for air. Just as the full fury of the storm hit, the world outside vanished into a roaring, brown chaos. Sand and dirt seeped through every crack, a fine, gritty rain that covered everything. They sat in the dim light, the roar of the wind a constant, deafening presence. Noah, who had been hiding under the table, crawled out and leaned against his mother, his small body trembling. "I am scared. Mama," he whispered. Sarah wrapped her arms around him, pulling him close. She smoothed his hair, her own heart pounding. She looked at his terrified face and knew she had to be his anchor. "It is all right to be scared." "Noah," she said, her voice soft but steady. "Grown-ups get scared too, but being scared is not a reason to run away. It just means we have to be brave." She looked over at Caleb, who was watching them, his expression unreadable in the gloom. The storm raged for hours. When it finally began to subside, leaving a world buried in dust, a bone-deep chill had settled into the small house. Caleb built a fire in the stove, and its warmth slowly pushed back the cold. They were exhausted, filthy, and covered in a fine layer of grit. Caleb stood up and took off his heavy canvas jacket, which was damp and caked with mud. He walked over to Sarah, who was shivering slightly, and draped it over her shoulders. "You will catch a chill," he said, his voice rough. As he settled the jacket around her, his hand brushed against hers. It was a simple, accidental touch, skin against skin, but in the charged silence of the small room, it felt like a bolt of lightning. They both froze, their eyes meeting across the small space. The world seemed to stop. There was no sound but the crackle of the fire and the soft sigh of the wind outside. In that one silent moment, something shifted between them. It was not passion, but it was something just as powerful. It was a profound and unspoken understanding, a recognition of the shared burden they carried. Caleb was the first to look away, clearing his throat and turning back toward the fire. The moment was over, but it left an indelible mark, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire or the heavy jacket she now wore. The day after the storm, Sarah walked to the edge of her property, to the small, shallow creek where a single, ancient cottonwood tree grew. Its roots ran deep, holding the earth together, its leaves whispering in the clean, washed air. It had been her mother's favorite spot. As a child, Sarah had believed the tree held the spirits of her ancestors. Now, standing under its broad, protective branches, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. She tied her kerchief tightly over her hair, a small act of defiance against the dust and the chaos. This was her land. These were her roots. She would not let them be torn out. She was so lost in thought that she did not hear the approaching rider until the horse was nearly upon her. She turned, her hand flying to her throat, expecting to see Jasper, but it was not him. It was a woman, her face pale and frightened under the brim of a fashionable but travel-stained hat. It was Lila May. She slid from her horse, her hands twisting the reins nervously. She looked nothing like the confident, smiling girl who served whiskey at the saloon. She looked like a cornered animal. "I have to talk to you," she said, her voice a rushed, desperate whisper. "I cannot stay long. He thinks I am in my room." Sarah stood her ground, her expression wary. "What do you want?" "I came to warn you," Lila May said, her eyes darting around as if she expected to be attacked at any moment. "This is not just about Jasper wanting money for some investment. He is in trouble. Real trouble." She took a deep, shuddering breath. "He owes money to the Devlin crew. A lot of money. He lost it gambling." Sarah's blood ran cold. The Devlin crew were not just ranchers. They were rustlers and hired guns, men who settled their debts with violence. "He promised them," Lila May continued, her words tumbling over one another. "He told them he would get the money from selling this land. He said it was a sure thing. But now you are fighting him, and they are getting impatient. They are not patient men. Mrs. Whitfield. If Jasper does not pay them, they will not just go after him. They will come here. They will take the cattle, the horses, everything. They will burn what they do not take, and they will not care who gets in their way." The air, so clean just a moment before, suddenly felt thick and hard to breathe. The legal battle, the town's disapproval, it all seemed trivial now. The threat was no longer just a piece of paper. It had a face and a name and a reputation for brutality that was known all across the territory. Jasper had not just brought shame to her door. He had brought the promise of bloodshed. The fight for the ranch had become a fight for her life, and for the life of her son. Lila May's warning settled like a shroud over the ranch. The fear was no longer a vague dread of the bank or the town's disapproval. It was sharp, specific, and smelled of gunpowder. Sarah now looked at the vast, open prairie, not as a space of freedom, but as an undefended vulnerability. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like an approaching rider. The day of the preliminary hearing arrived with a cold, gray sky that promised nothing good. Sarah rode into town on the buckboard with Caleb beside her, his presence a silent, solid reassurance. Noah sat between them, his small face serious. Sarah had left him with Mrs. Gable once they reached town, not wanting him to set foot in a place where his father would try to take him away. The courtroom was small and stuffy, smelling of old paper, stale tobacco, and nervous sweat. Jasper was already there, standing with his lawyer, looking confident and wronged. He was dressed in a fine suit, a picture of respectability that made Sarah's stomach churn. Mr. Kramer sat in the front row, his arms folded, a silent pillar of support for Jasper's cause. The room was filled with the curious, the judgmental, and the few who had come to stand with her Mrs. Gable, Elias the mail carrier, and Dr. Murphy. Magistrate Thompson was a stern, hawk-nosed man who did not look like he had smiled since the last good rain. He listened patiently as Jasper's lawyer painted a picture of a flighty, unstable woman who had fallen under the influence of a neighbor and was neglecting her wifely duties, culminating in a mysterious fire that had endangered her own child. When it was Sarah's turn, she felt a tremor in her hands. But then she looked at Caleb, and at Mrs. Gable's encouraging nod, and her fear hardened into resolve. Her lawyer presented the original deed of sale, clearly showing that the bulk of the property had been purchased with her dowry. It was a solid piece of evidence that visibly annoyed Jasper. Then her witnesses spoke. Mrs. Gable testified to Sarah's diligence and her deep love for her son. Elias spoke of her tireless work, of seeing her light on at all hours, of her refusal to give up. Dr. Murphy described her skill with the animals, her calm under pressure. They spoke of her character, painting a picture of a woman who was the very opposite of the one Jasper's lawyer had described. In the end, Magistrate Thompson's face was grim. He looked from Jasper's handsome, impatient face to Sarah's tired but determined one. "This is a messy business," he declared, his voice gravelly. "The paperwork is clear on one point, Mrs. Whitfield has a significant prior claim to a portion of this land through her dowry. However, Mr. Whitfield's name is also on the deed for the property as a whole." He peered down at them over his spectacles. "I am not prepared to order the sale of this property today. This court grants a 30-day period of reconciliation. I suggest you two go home and find a way to sort this out like civilized human beings." He then turned his gaze to the matter of the boy. "In the interim, temporary custody of the child, Noah Whitfield, will remain with his mother. However," he added, raising a hand to forestall any relief on Sarah's face, "Mr. Whitfield, as the boy's father, is granted visitation rights. He is to be allowed to see his son twice a week on the property." The gavel fell with a final, echoing crack. It was a victory, but a hollow one. She had kept her home for another 30 days, but she had been forced to let the wolf back to the door. Jasper was furious. The hearing had not given him the quick victory he needed. He stormed out of the courthouse, his face a thundercloud. That night, he rode out not to the saloon, but to a desolate, rocky outcrop 5 miles out of town. He did not have to wait long. 2 riders emerged from the darkness, their faces hidden by the shadows of their hats. They were lean, hard men who moved with the quiet menace of predators. They were from the Devlin crew. "You do not have the money," the taller of the 2 men said. It was not a question. "I will have it," Jasper insisted, his voice a little too loud, a little too shaky. "The judge is just slowing things down. A legal technicality." The man chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "We are not interested in legal technicalities. Whitfield, we are interested in what we are owed. Our patience is wearing thin." Desperation clawed at Jasper. "I have something better than money," he said, leaning forward in his saddle. "Information. There are 2 herds, side by side, mine and the neighbors. Not large, but the calves are healthy. They use a grazing path down by the creek to water them. It is isolated. No one would see you. I can tell you the best time. I can tell you how many men the neighbor has." The 2 riders looked at each other. "And what is in it for you?" the tall one asked. "My debt cleared," Jasper said quickly, "and a small share, just enough to get me on my feet. Consider it a finder's fee." The man was silent for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "All right, Whitfield, you tell us everything. But know this, if this goes wrong, if you are lying to us, we will not take you to court. We will find you, and we will collect our debt from your hide." The next few days at the ranch were thick with a tense, unspoken dread. Sarah tried to maintain a routine for Noah's sake, but the fear was a constant, metallic taste in her mouth. Jasper's first visit was a torment. He arrived in the afternoon, his presence a violation of the fragile peace she and Caleb had built. He ignored Sarah completely, focusing on Noah with a false, hearty cheerfulness that did not fool the boy for a second. Noah was quiet and withdrawn, answering his father's questions with single words, his eyes constantly seeking out his mother. Jasper walked around the property, his gaze lingering on the livestock, his eyes counting, assessing. He was not visiting his son. He was taking inventory. That night, As Sarah tucked Noah into bed, he pointed a small finger toward the window. A single, brilliant star streaked across the inky black sky. "Look, Mama," he whispered, his voice full of awe. "Grandma is saying hello." It was something Sarah had told him once, a gentle story to explain the death of the grandmother he had never met. Her heart ached. The world was full of men like Jasper and the Devlin crew, and here was this small boy, looking for magic in the sky. She smoothed his hair back from his forehead. "She is watching over you, sweet boy," she said softly, "but we have to remember. No magic can ever replace hard work and being careful." The next morning, Caleb found the tracks. He had been riding the fence line near the creek, checking for weaknesses, when he saw them in the soft mud by the water's edge. 2 horses shod with a distinctive V-shaped shoe he did not recognize. They were not from his ranch, or from Sarah's. They had stood there for some time, looking out over the grazing pasture where both their herds mingled. He did not say anything to Sarah. He did not want to add to her fear. Instead, he went to work. He spent the afternoon with his hired hand, Jeb, stringing thin, nearly invisible tripwires across the narrowest parts of the grazing path. To each wire, he tied a small string of cowbells, hiding them in the dense brush. It was a simple alarm, but it would be enough to wake the dead on a quiet night. He cleaned and oiled his rifle, and he told Jeb to do the same. They would take turns watching that night. The moon rose cold and white, bathing the prairie in a stark, silvery light. The dry grass shimmered, looking less like a field and more like a vast, frozen sea of tin. The silence was absolute, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the distant, lonely cry of a coyote. Sarah could not sleep. She sat in a chair by her window, a heavy shotgun lying across her lap, watching the moonlit landscape. Every shadow seemed to move. Every rustle of the wind sounded like a footstep. The attack came just after midnight. It was not a sound that woke her, but a sudden, violent clangor of bells from the direction of the creek, a frantic, jangling alarm that shattered the night's silence. It was followed almost immediately by a shout, and then the sharp crack of a rifle. Her heart leaped into her throat. She ran to Noah's room, her hands shaking. He was already sitting up in bed, his eyes wide with terror. "Stay here," she whispered, her voice fierce. "Get under the bed and do not come out, no matter what you hear." She ran back to the window, her knuckles white on the stock of the shotgun. In the cold, bright moonlight, she could see them 6 riders, dark shapes moving swiftly toward the herd, trying to cut out the calves. She saw the flash of 2 more rifles from the direction of Caleb's barn, where he and Jeb had taken up positions. The rustlers were caught by surprise, expecting a silent, easy raid. Now they were exposed, the bells still echoing, the shots pinning them down. They returned fire, the night exploding into a chaotic symphony of shouts, gunfire, and the terrified bawling of cattle. From her vantage point, Sarah could see the whole terrible scene unfold. She saw Caleb, a solid, unmoving figure, firing with a calm, deadly precision. She saw Jeb beside him, reloading and firing, a loyal shadow. The rustlers, their plan ruined, began to fall back, firing wildly as they retreated toward the cover of the creek bed. And then she saw something else. On a small rise, just beyond the edge of the fight, sat a single rider. He was not shooting. He was just watching, even from a distance, in the pale moonlight. She recognized the fine horse, the confident posture. It was Jasper. He had come to watch his plan unfold, to witness the ruin of his neighbors and the theft of his own livestock. As the rustlers broke and fled, one of them turned and fired a last, desperate shot toward Caleb's position. Sarah saw Caleb stagger, his hand flying to his shoulder. He did not fall, but he stumbled back, leaning against the barn for support. On the rise, Jasper saw it too. He saw the raid fail. He saw Caleb get hit, and he did not ride down to help. He did not charge after the men who had betrayed him. He turned his fine horse around and, without a single backward glance, spurred it into a gallop, disappearing into the darkness, a coward running from the chaos he had created. The aftermath of the raid was a landscape of surreal stillness. The moon, which had illuminated the violence, now cast a cold, indifferent light on the trampled grass and the dark, spreading stain on Caleb's shoulder. Sarah worked with a focused intensity that left no room for fear. She tore a strip from her own petticoat, her hands steady as she pressed the makeshift bandage against the wound. It was a deep graze, bleeding freely, but the bullet had passed clean through the muscle. He was lucky. They were all lucky. "It is not as bad as it looks," Caleb said through gritted teeth, his face pale in the moonlight. Jeb, his hired hand, stood nearby, his rifle held at the ready, his young face a mixture of adrenaline and awe. "It is bad enough," Sarah countered, her voice low and tight. She finished tying the bandage, her touch gentle but firm. "We need to get you to a doctor." "There is no time," he said, pushing himself to a standing position, hissing as a fresh wave of pain shot through him. "The rest of them will be back, or the sheriff will be coming. We need to be ready." The ride to town for the final hearing felt different. The air was not just filled with dust and dread, but with the sharp, metallic scent of gunpowder and the raw memory of violence. Sheriff Dawes and his deputies had ridden out at dawn, collected the spent shell casings, and followed the rustlers' tracks until they disappeared into the rocky Badlands. The sheriff had listened intently to Caleb's account, his eyes lingering on the cowbells still hanging from the tripwires. He had looked at the boot print Jasper had left behind on the rise, a clear impression in the damp earth from a brief downpour the week before. The law was now moving alongside their personal battle. When they arrived in Redemption Flats, the street was already crowded. Word of the shootout had spread like wildfire, and the whole town had turned out. Their faces a mixture of fear, morbid curiosity, and judgment. As Sarah guided the buckboard toward the courthouse, a low murmur rippled through the crowd. Then she saw what they were all looking at. Nailed to the public information board outside the general store was a large, crudely printed broadsheet, the kind favored by sensationalist newspapers from the city. The ink was still fresh, the headline enormous, black, and brutal. Her husband left for a younger woman. The rancher next door vowed to guard her heart forever. A hot, suffocating wave of shame washed over Sarah. Her private agony, her quiet struggle, had been twisted into a cheap, sordid spectacle for public consumption. Her cheeks burned. She wanted to turn the buckboard around, to flee back to the ranch and hide. The whispers around them grew louder, a chorus of speculation and condemnation. She felt a hand on her arm. It was Caleb. He had not flinched. He sat straight and tall, his wounded shoulder held stiffly, his gaze fixed not on the offensive headline, but on the faces in the crowd. He stood up in the buckboard, his voice clear and steady, cutting through the murmuring. "My name is Caleb Hart," he said, his voice ringing with an authority that commanded their attention. "Last night, my neighbor, Sarah Whitfield, her son, and my hired hand were attacked by rustlers. We defended our homes. We defended our property." He paused, his gaze sweeping over them, meeting the eyes of Mrs. Thornton, of Mr. Kramer, of Reverend Pike. "That piece of paper is filled with the lies designed to sell newspapers. The truth is much simpler. I am protecting a good, hard-working woman and her child from a man who would see them destroyed. I am protecting this land, and I have no intention of stopping." He sat back down, the silence that followed his words more profound than the noise that had preceded it. He had not defended his own honor. He had defended hers. He had taken their ugly gossip and thrown it back in their faces, armed with nothing but the plain, unvarnished truth. Inside the courtroom, the air was even thicker with anticipation. This was no longer just a hearing about property. It was a showdown. Jasper was there, looking pale and nervous, his fine suit appearing rumpled and out of place. He could not meet Sarah's eyes. The proceedings began, and Jasper's lawyer's arguments, which had seemed so powerful before, now sounded hollow and petty in the wake of real violence. Then Sarah's witnesses were called again. This time, their words carried a new weight. Mrs. Gable spoke of Sarah's courage. Elias spoke of her unending resilience. Dr. Murphy spoke of her as a protector of life. The turning point came when Sheriff Dawes took the stand. He laid out the evidence with methodical precision. He produced the shell casings found at the scene, identifying them as coming from rifles not owned by Caleb or Sarah. He presented a plaster cast of the unique V-shaped horseshoe prints, matching them to a known brand used by the Devlin crew. And then he produced his final piece of evidence. It was another plaster cast, this one of a boot print, taken from the rise where the lone rider had watched the attack. This print was made by a man's dress boot, the sheriff said, his voice flat. A fancy, city-made boot with a distinctive heel plate. He paused, letting his gaze fall directly on Jasper. It appears to be a perfect match for the boots Mr. Whitfield is wearing right now. A collective gasp went through the courtroom. Jasper looked down at his feet as if they had betrayed him. He began to sweat, his face turning the color of ash. His lawyer jumped to his feet, objecting loudly. But the damage was done. And then the courtroom door opened. Lila May stood there, her face pale but her eyes resolute. She was no longer the frightened girl by the creek. She had found a core of courage Sarah would not have thought possible. She walked to the stand, her head held high. Her testimony was a floodgate opening. She told the court everything. She spoke of Jasper's gambling debts, of his desperate deal with the Devlin crew. She told them how he had given the rustlers the layout of the ranches, the location of the herd, the best time to attack. Her voice trembled, but it never broke. She was a woman who had seen the ugly truth and had chosen, at great personal risk, not to look away. When she was finished, a dead silence hung in the room. All eyes were on Jasper. He looked trapped, his charming facade completely shattered, revealing the desperate, cornered man beneath. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the wooden floor. He looked wildly toward the door, his eyes darting like a spooked animal. He was going to run. Before he could take 2 steps, the deputy was on him, a firm hand on his shoulder. Jasper crumpled, all the fight going out of him. At that exact moment, the courtroom doors opened again, and another deputy entered, his face grim. He leaned over and whispered in Sheriff Dawes's ear. The sheriff stood. "Magistrate," he announced, his voice booming in the silent room. "I have just received word, acting on information regarding the failed raid. My deputies set up a blockade on the Old Canyon Trail. They have apprehended the entirety of the Devlin crew. They are in custody." It was over. The whole rotten conspiracy had been brought down. Magistrate Thompson looked at Sarah, his stern face softened with something that looked almost like respect. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, "do you have anything you wish to say?" Sarah stood up, her hands clasped in front of her. She looked not at the judge, not at Jasper, but at the faces of the townspeople who had judged her so harshly. All the shame, all the fear, all the humiliation she had endured seemed to fall away. She had survived. She had fought back. She had nothing left to be ashamed of. "My honor is not something that can be given to me by a court or taken away by gossip," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I have done nothing but work hard, protect my son, and defend my home. I have lived my life honestly, day by day. That is my honor, and it is enough." Magistrate Thompson brought his gavel down with a resounding crack. In light of the criminal proceedings now pending against Jasper Whitfield, he declared, "This court grants Sarah Whitfield's sole and uncontested use and control of the Whitfield Ranch until such time as those proceedings are concluded. Furthermore, all foreclosure actions by the Redemption Flats Bank are hereby suspended, pending an investigation into possible coercion and conspiracy." That evening, a profound quiet settled over the ranch. Noah was asleep, his face peaceful for the first time in weeks. Sarah and Caleb sat at her kitchen table, the silence between them comfortable, but filled with the unspoken emotions of the day. Sarah's hands were trembling now, the adrenaline finally leaving her body, replaced by a deep, shuddering exhaustion. "I was so afraid," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She looked at him, her eyes filled with a vulnerability he had never seen before, not just of Jasper or the rustlers. "I'm afraid of this, of feeling safe, of trusting someone again, only to have them leave, or be taken." Caleb reached across the small table and took her trembling hand in his. His touch was warm, his grip steady. He did not offer empty platitudes or easy promises. He looked at her, his gaze direct and filled with a quiet, powerful sincerity. "I cannot promise you a life without storms." "Sarah," he said, his voice low and rough with emotion, "the prairie does not make those kinds of promises. But I can promise you this, I will stand beside you when they come. I am not going anywhere." As he spoke, a sound began, soft at first, then growing stronger, a gentle tapping against the window pane. Both of them looked up. It was a sound they had almost forgotten. The sky, which had been clear and cold just an hour before, was now filled with dark, heavy clouds. A drop of water hit the dusty ground outside, then another and another. The rain had come, a slow, steady, life-giving rain was falling on the parched and wounded land. It was washing away the dust. It was washing away the blood. It was the sound of a long, terrible drought finally breaking. The rain fell for 3 straight days. It was not a violent, storming rain, but a slow, steady, soaking gift from a sky that had been merciless for months. It drummed on the roof of the small house, a sound of healing and absolution. It washed the red dust from the land, turning the parched fields a deep, rich brown and filling the creek bed with a gurgling, happy song. The new well, which had been their symbol of defiance, was now overflowing, a testament to their labor. In town, the wheels of justice, which had turned so slowly and reluctantly at first, now moved with a swift and final gravity. The trial of the Devlin crew was a short, grim affair. Faced with the testimony of their own captured members and the undeniable evidence gathered by Sheriff Dawes, they were quickly convicted. The sentences were long and hard. Jasper's trial followed. He stood in the dock a shrunken man, the swagger and charm stripped away, leaving only a hollow shell of vanity and fear. Lila May's testimony was the final nail in his coffin. He was found guilty of conspiracy to commit robbery and of arson for the fire that had destroyed Sarah's hay barn. The magistrate, his face like carved stone, sentenced him to 20 years of hard labor in the territorial prison. As they led him away, he did not look at Sarah. He did not look at anyone. He was a ghost, already erased from the life he had so carelessly thrown away. A week later, the stagecoach driver left a small, sealed envelope for Sarah. The handwriting on the front was an elegant, feminine script. Inside, a short note was written on a single sheet of paper. "Dear Mrs. Whitfield, I am leaving this town, and I do not expect to return. There is nothing I can say that will undo the harm that was done to you. I only wish to say that I am sorry for my part in it. I was a fool to believe in a man like Jasper, but a person can get so tired of being poor and alone that they will believe in almost any promise. I hope you and your boy find the peace you deserve. I was only ever a person trying to find a way to live. Sincerely, Lila May." Sarah read the letter twice, then slowly folded it and tucked it into her apron pocket. There was no anger left in her, only a profound and weary sadness for a girl who had made a bad bargain with the world. With the threat of Jasper and the Devlins gone, and with the bank's investigation revealing Mr. Kramer's unethical attempts to force the sale, the town of Redemption Flats seemed to take a long, collective breath. The tide of gossip receded, replaced by a grudging, Then a genuine respect. When Sarah and Caleb rode into town for supplies, heads would nod in their direction. Mrs. Thornton, seeing them at the general store, actually offered a tight, almost imperceptible smile before hurrying on her way. The two ranches began to breathe as one. The fence that separated them was still there, but it was no longer a barrier. It was just a line on a map of a shared life. They pooled their money to buy seed for the spring planting. They took turns riding the fence lines, checking for breaks. They worked together to build a small, earthen dam across a low point in the creek, creating a reservoir of precious water that would see them through the next dry season. Their days fell into a rhythm of shared labor, of easy silences and quiet conversations over evening meals. It was a partnership forged not in a flurry of passion, but in the slow, steady heat of shared struggle and mutual reliance. One evening, the three of them were sitting on the porch, watching the last of the sun's orange glow fade from the sky. Noah, who had been quietly whittling a piece of soft wood Caleb had given him, looked up, his expression serious. "Mama," he said, his small voice clear in the twilight, "is Caleb going to be my pa now?" The question was so direct, so simple, that it caught Sarah completely off guard. The breath caught in her throat. She looked at her son, at his earnest, hopeful face, and her heart felt like it was breaking and healing all at the same time. She looked at Caleb, who had frozen, his gaze fixed on the boy, his own face a mask of complex emotions. She reached out and pulled Noah into her lap, holding him tight. "Caleb is a very dear friend. Sweet boy," she whispered, her voice thick. "A very good man." It was not a yes, but it was not a no. It was the only answer she could give right now. Later that week, Caleb saddled his horse and rode to the small, wind-swept cemetery on the hill overlooking the town. He stopped before a simple wooden cross that marked the grave of his wife, Mary. The wild flowers he had planted a year ago were gone, withered by the drought, but new green shoots were already pushing their way through the damp earth. He stood there for a long time, his hat in his hands, the wind gently rustling the dry grass. He did not speak aloud, but the words were clear in his own mind. He told her about the drought, about the fire, about the fight. He told her about Sarah, about her strength and her stubborn pride. He told her about the boy, about his quiet resilience. He was not asking for permission. He was offering an explanation. He was making a quiet, solemn promise to a memory. "I loved you, Mary. I will always love the part of my life that was you. But my heart is not a grave. I am going to love again. It will be different. It will not replace what we had. It will not betray it. It will simply be what comes next." He placed a smooth, gray stone he had been carrying from the creek bed at the base of the cross, then turned and rode away. A weight he had not even been fully aware he was carrying lifted from his shoulders. Their wedding was not in the church. It was in the meadow behind the main barn, on a patch of new grass that had sprung up after the rains. There were no fancy dresses or formal suits. Sarah wore a simple blue calico dress, the one she saved for trips to town. Caleb wore a clean work shirt and trousers. Their boots were scuffed and tinged with the mud of the ranch. There were only a handful of guests. Jeb, his face scrubbed clean, Mrs. Gable, who had tears in her eyes, Elias, the mail carrier, and Dr. Murphy. To Sarah's surprise, Reverend Pike was there to officiate. He had come to the ranch the day before, his hat in his hands, and had made a quiet, heartfelt apology for his earlier judgment. "I was a man who saw the rules, but not the people," he had said. "You have taught me a valuable lesson. Sarah, you and Caleb." The ceremony was short and simple. The rings they exchanged were plain bands of silver Caleb had bought at the general store. The meal that followed was not a feast. It was cornbread, baked beans, and fresh, cool water from the well. but as they all sat on blankets spread on the grass, a sense of profound peace and rightness settled over the small gathering. This was not a celebration of a fairy tale romance. It was a celebration of survival, of partnership, of a love that had grown slowly and quietly in the hardest of soils. The next day, Caleb and Sarah took down a section of the fence that separated their two properties. In its place, they built a wide, sturdy gate, a symbol of their two lives becoming one. From now on, there would be no Hart Ranch and no Whitfield Ranch. There would only be their home. A few weeks later, Elias the mail carrier made a special trip out to the ranch. He was carrying a letter with an official-looking wax seal on the back. It was not from the bank, or from the court. The postmark was from Cheyenne, the territorial capital. Sarah took the letter, a flicker of the old apprehension stirring within her. She broke the seal and unfolded the heavy paper. It was from the Union Pacific Railroad Company. It was a formal notice. Surveys had been completed, and a new branch line was to be constructed, connecting Cheyenne to the silver mining towns in the mountains. The proposed route, the letter stated, would pass directly through the northern edge of her property, across the low, rolling hills that had always been her best summer pasture. The railroad was coming, and with it, a new world of opportunity, and a new kind of danger she could not yet begin to imagine. The letter from the Union Pacific Railroad Company lay on the kitchen table, a crisp white rectangle that seemed both a promise and a threat. For a week, it was the silent guest at every meal, the subject of every hushed conversation after Noah had gone to sleep. The offer was staggering, a sum of money that would not just pay off the last of Jasper's old bank loan, but would leave them with more than they had ever dreamed of. It was, as the letter stated, a chance to secure their future for generations to come. All they had to do was sell a wide swath of their northern pasture, the gently rolling hills where the cattle grew fat in the summer. The offer created the first real friction in their new life together. It was a debate born not of anger, but of two different histories, two different sets of fears. Think of it, Caleb, Sarah argued one evening, her hands tracing the proposed route on the survey map. We could pay off everything. We could buy a new bull, a real stud. We could build a proper schoolhouse right here, on this corner of the land. Noah would not have to ride 12 miles into town for his lessons. The other ranch children could come, too. We could build something that lasts. She saw the money as a tool, a way to forge a better, safer world than the one she had known. Caleb stood by the window, looking out at the land in question, his face troubled. His wound had healed into a puckered scar on his shoulder, a permanent reminder of the violence that had nearly torn them apart. And what happens when the train comes through? Sarah, it will not just be a train. It will be noise and smoke and strangers. It will bring the city closer. We fought so hard for this peace, for this quiet. Are we going to sell it for the jingle of coin in our pocket? He saw the money as a lure, a temptation that could lead them away from the simple, hard-won life they had built. Their discussions were long and honest. Stretching late into the night, they were testing the foundation of their new marriage, learning how to build a decision together, brick by brick. They were still at an impasse when a smart, polished buggy, a vehicle unlike any seen in Redemption Flats, rolled up the lane to their house. A man in a city suit and a derby hat stepped out. He was tall and well-dressed, with a confident air that seemed out of place against the rustic backdrop of the ranch. He walked to the porch, his eyes scanning the property with a practiced, appraising gaze. And as he got closer, Caleb, who had stepped outside to meet him, simply froze. The blood drained from his face. The man stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, his confident smile wavering as he looked at Caleb. "Hello, little brother," he said, his voice a little uncertain. It was Eli Hart, Caleb's older brother. He had left the family farm 15 years ago after a bitter fight with their father, heading east to seek his fortune. He had found it, first in banking and then in the booming railroad business. He had not been back for their father's funeral. He had not been back when Mary died. He was a ghost from a life Caleb had long since buried. Sarah came to the door, wiping her hands on her apron, sensing the sudden, immense tension. She looked from Caleb's pale, rigid face to the stranger's familiar but older one. The family resemblance was unmistakable. "Eli," Caleb finally said, the name tasting like rust in his mouth. "What are you doing here?" "I am the regional director for the Union Pacific expansion," Eli said, his gaze shifting to Sarah, a flicker of surprise and curiosity in his eyes. "I am here to finalize the purchase of the land easement." That night, the conversation around the kitchen table was strained. Eli spoke of progress, of the great iron artery that would bring prosperity and civilization to the territory. He laid out the final offer, an even more generous sum than the one in the letter. He spoke with the smooth, persuasive confidence of a man used to getting what he wants. Caleb was mostly silent, his answers to his brother's questions clipped and short, after Noah was in bed, and after Eli had tactfully retired to the small spare room. Sarah and Caleb finally spoke. "He has no right," Caleb said, his voice low and tight with an old anger. "He has no right to come back here after all this time and talk to me about what is best for this land. He abandoned it. He abandoned us." Sarah came and stood behind him, placing her hands on his stiff shoulders. "He is still your brother, Caleb." "He stopped being my brother the day he turned his back on our father." The next morning, the two brothers walked the land together, their steps falling on the same soil that held their separate, fractured memories. They walked in silence for a long time, the tension between them as vast as the prairie sky. Finally, by the ancient cottonwood tree at the creek, Eli stopped. "I was wrong," he said, not looking at Caleb. "I should have come back. For Pa, for Mary. I was a coward. I built a new life, and I was afraid to look at the old one, afraid it would show me what I had lost." He finally turned to face his brother, his eyes filled with a regret that was 15 years old. "I am not here to take anything from you, Caleb. I am here to make an offer, and maybe to see if there is anything left of my family." Caleb looked at his brother, at the fine suit and the city hands, but for the first time, he also saw the boy he had grown up with, the brother he had once idolized. The hard anger in his own heart began to soften. "We will not sell the whole pasture," Caleb said, his voice firm, but the bitter edge was gone. "The soul of this place is not for sale." He then laid out the idea that he and Sarah had slowly, painstakingly built together over the past week. A new proposal. "We will sell you a path, a narrow corridor, just wide enough for your tracks and a service road. No more. And in exchange for that, and for a fair price, your company will do something for this community. You will build a water bridge, an aqueduct, to carry water from the upper reservoir down to this valley. You will help us build a cistern that will hold enough water for every family within 10 miles to see them through a drought." Eli stared at him, a slow smile spreading across his face. It was not the smile of a businessman who had just been outmaneuvered. It was the smile of a man seeing his little brother for the first time in a long time. "A path, not our roots," Eli said, nodding slowly. "Pa would have liked that." The deal was struck. The railroad company, eager to secure the route and build goodwill, agreed to the terms. The whole community benefited from the stubbornness and foresight of the two people they had once been so quick to condemn. The inauguration of the new water bridge was a town-wide celebration. It stood as a marvel of engineering, a wooden artery that promised life and security. The whole of Redemption Flats was there, sharing food and drink under the bright, clear sky. In the middle of the celebration, Mrs. Thornton approached Sarah. The formidable woman looked smaller, her face etched with an unaccustomed humility. She took Sarah's hand, her own soft and plump, and squeezed it gently. "Sarah," she said, her voice a low murmur, I I was wrong about you. I said things. I was unkind. Her eyes welled up. I misjudged you terribly. Sarah looked at the woman who had caused her so much pain, and she felt no triumph, only a quiet sense of an old wound finally closing. The dust gets on all of us out here. Mrs. Thornton, she said, her voice gentle, a small, wry smile touching her lips. Your dust got on my dress, and my dust probably got on yours. The important thing is that the rain came and washed it all away. Mrs. Thornton looked at her, a tear tracing a path down her powdered cheek, and for the first time, she smiled a real, genuine smile. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in strokes of fiery orange and deep purple, Sarah stood by the corral fence. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and sweet grass. Inside the corral, Noah, now almost 7, was riding a small, steady pony of his own, his face a perfect picture of intense concentration and pure joy. Caleb stood in the center of the ring, offering quiet words of encouragement, his voice a low, reassuring rumble. Sarah leaned against the rough wood of the fence, a deep, bone-weary contentment settling over her. They had survived. They had built a life not out of dreams, but out of the hard, unyielding reality of their days. They had taken the dust and the fire and the hatred and had somehow, together, transformed it into a foundation. Caleb walked over and stood beside her, his arm sliding around her waist, pulling her close. They stood in comfortable silence, watching their son circle the corral as the first stars began to prick the velvet dark of the sky. Sarah leaned her head against his good shoulder, the one that did not bear the scar of their struggle. She thought of all the days behind them, and all the days to come. The railroad would bring changes, the world would keep turning, and new storms would surely rise. But for the first time in her life, she was not afraid. She was home. She turned her face up to his, her voice a soft whisper, not a plea, but a statement of fact, a vow sealed in the quiet of the twilight. Do not ever leave my heart. Caleb smiled, a slow, deep smile that reached his eyes. He leaned down and kissed her forehead, his lips warm against her skin. There is nowhere else, he said, his voice a low, husky promise that I would rather be. Thank you for being a part of our story tonight. We would love to hear where you are listening from in the comments so we can all connect and share. And please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Night, like the video, and press that hype button to help this story reach more listeners.